Okay, hello to everybody who's already in the Zoom meeting. We are going to hold on for just a moment longer while we wait for people to trickle in.
Oh, the dog is so cutie.
Yeah, she'd be making a big ruckus if I don't let her in, so it's easier to just have her join along.
What's her name?
Her name is Bonnie. Yeah.
She's adorable.
Thank you.
I'm not a dog person, but there's certain dogs that I find acceptable.
The dogs that look like little stuffed animals, like live stuffed animals. That's what the kind of dogs that people like Dorothy and me like.
Yeah, and she's very gentle. She's not like a jumpy, you know.
Yeah. I'm afraid of dogs.
Not like
No,
relaxed.
she's definitely a lap dog.
Yeah, that's so good. Like a cat. I mean, because I like cats, so you know, cats. She's cat-like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And I notice, of course, she's not barking, unlike the creatures that live around me. I didn't realize because I've never had a dog, been around dogs or anything like that. I did not realize that dogs can be trained not to bark.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And when I heard that, I was just even more upset by how inconsiderate this person has a dog that's kind of like, you know, cougar size, lion size, bobcat size. I mean, this is a huge dog. And when it barks, it barks loud enough, even though it's a couple of houses away. You know, when something's really loud, it causes vibrations in your chest. That's how loud.
Oh my goodness.
Barks.
Yeah.
It causes that vibration in your chest. It shows that it's a really, really loud noise. So
Yeah.
it's ridiculous.
So it is 3:34 right now. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Hello, Zoom room. Welcome to the third and final installment of Understanding White Supremacy with Barbara Smith. My name is Sienna Thiem, and I am a member of Extinction Rebellion of the Capital Region. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to Dorothy Tristman. However, before we get started, I have a couple of things that I'm going to go over with you. So for this meeting, we are going to be using the Q&A format, and it may be a little bit different than you've seen at other Zoom webinars, because we are going to ask that you use the raise hand feature instead of the written Q&A function. You'll notice that it's turned off for this talk. So at some point towards the end of the webinar, we will be opening up the meeting for questions. And at that point, if you do have a question, then you can use the raise hand feature, which should be at the bottom of the screen. If you're on your phone, you might have to press the ... the ellipsis, and then you'll see it in the drop-down menu there. And then we will try to get as many questions in as we can. And we mentioned this in the email that went out with the registration, but if you have not already, and if you are able, then we would request that you give a donation to the Barbara Smith Caring Circle, and you can find the link to that in the chat, which is also going to be at the bottom of the screen. So I believe that is everything that I had to go over. So I will introduce you to Dorothy Tristman, who is a fellow activist with Extinction Rebellion of the Capital Region. and she's also involved in the Solidarity Committee of the Capital Region. And she's a marvelous teacher of peer counseling, and she will be giving the introduction now. So go ahead, Dorothy.
Thank you so much, Sienna. And actually, thank you to Chris Riley, who's not visible at the moment, but he's done so much legwork on making this event happen, these 3 webinars. And of course, it's my great pleasure to introduce Barbara Smith for this 3rd webinar on in this series of Understanding White Supremacy. Barbara is a brilliant Black feminist, author, educator, lifelong activist, radical scholar, former elected official here in Albany. I really could go on about what a brilliant activist educator she is, and how devoted she is to making the world better, and using all of her talents to do that. One of my favorite things about Barbara is how she was pioneered in the understanding of the concept of intersectionality, starting with the Combahee River Collective Statement. It's a very useful tool, that concept, in understanding how oppressions need to be looked at as intersecting. And she was also a founder of Kitchen Table Press, which gave voice to previously unacknowledged women of color writers, pioneer there too. And one thing I think you can see from Barbara's background, she loves books. She always has, ever since she was a young person. I know from conversations with her that, you know, how committed she is to, as an educator, to making sure that people read a lot of books to undo some of the miseducation that we've been subjected to due to actually the system of white supremacy and its influence on our educational system. I heard it for the first time, her first lecture that she did for us, calling what we learn at school is the history of nostalgia, and we need to correct that. So part of that is, of course, reading a lot of books that are available at this point to correct that misinformation, but also Barbara's books. And I think, Chris, if you have them on chat, some of them, she's written books and articles. Do we have the chat? Oh, I guess we have to click on it here. Let me see. Yeah, well, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, 40 Years of Movement Building with Barbara Smith is I think Barbara's most recent book, but there are others. I'm just trying to, you know, all the women are white, no, wait a minute. I'm sorry. I'm getting it. I don't have it right in front of me, and it's such a wonderful title. Barbara, you want to say?
I'll be happy to.
Yes, please.
I don't know if you were had concluded, though.
Oh, well, all right. If you can talk about some of the other titles that you would recommend highly. I mean, I recommend all your books. I wanted to just wind up with this by saying that some of you may have heard Barbara on Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! Last Friday, where she was being interviewed by about her two most recent articles, the one in the Boston Globe and The Nation, about white supremacy and what we can do about it, basically. Her plan is described by, similar to the Marshall Plan, is it the Baker Hamer-Baker Plan, which is a unique idea, beautiful idea about how to address dismantling white supremacy. And I thought it was very interesting that Amy Goodman asked you what it would take to implement it. And you said the political will. And so I just want to conclude my introduction with inviting everyone that's part of this program here, this project of learning more about this, to make that decision, to make that political will happen, to personally make that decision and be committed to it, and be life partners with you, Barbara, shoulder to shoulder, because you've been persistent for a long time. So anyway, that's how we're going to move towards the political will. So with that, I want to introduce Barbara Smith, and with much gratitude for your time that you give to us. Yeah, that's the kind of educator, organizer that you are. And thanks.
Thank you so much, Dorothy, Sienna, and Chris. I see that we're recording, so that's good, so that people can take advantage of this who are not necessarily here today. And we have a lot to cover, of course. This could be at least a semester course, if not a whole year. It's not a course, so of course it's a webinar. That strange way of interacting with people and communicating with people that we are in now in the midst of this ongoing pandemic. We have had, if you have not been with us previously, we've had 2 other sessions. They have been 2 weeks apart, starting on, I think, the 16th of August, and we had one on the 30th, and now this is our last one on today. And Dorothy was saying that I should mention book titles. I'm not going to take that time, but the one she wanted to, I think, have me say correctly is All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave, Black Women's Studies, is a punctuation part, punctuation point. And I know you love that, Chris. He thinks that he's learning about grammar and punctuation by our working together, which I think he writes kind of well, actually. Anyway, that's inside baseball, but it reflects that it's been a pleasure to work with all of the people who I've been in contact with who have helped to make these webinars happen. Today we are going to talk as much as we possibly can about how do you desegregate your life. And I also am going to be going over some of the materials that I suggested that people read for this session. There were 3 readings, and we're going to start then. And the webinar doesn't end when I stop presenting. The webinar ends at 5 o'clock after the question and answer period. Also, about that question and answer period, I would like to encourage people who are not necessarily multiply privileged to be free to and willing to ask questions. There's something called progressive stack. There's no way we could use progressive stack in this format, but what progressive stack does, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, the most marginalized voices are those that are called upon first, not paying attention necessarily to when a hand gets raised. And in this situation, I would love to hear from people who identify as women or femme or trans. So let's have the video. This is a video of Gary Young, who is an incredible mind. And you'll hear what he talks about. I actually got to meet him before he starts running it. I got to meet him last year in May, when both of us got honorary degrees from my alma mater, which is Mount Holyoke. One other thing, I live on a very noisy street. You can hear that, and I will try to mute. I'll mute while we're watching the video, but you may hear a lot of noise because of my being in a very noisy place. Thank you.
Oh, I think rights are often justified. I mean, what's the French Revolution? It's a riot blessed by history. Saying that rights are justified is different from saying that they are necessarily equipped. They're almost never equipped. What one has to ask oneself when social violence like this erupts, political violence like this erupts, is what other measures were available? What was their response to the peaceful protest of taking the knee? Well, they took Colin Kaepernick out and they did their best to crush that protest. I don't think that writing to your congressperson is going to fix this. And so this violence is a response to violence. It's no good quoting Martin Luther King at people unless you're going to talk about his anti-imperialism and the fact that he asked, well, who owns the oil and who owns the iron ore? He talked about socialism and a demand for fundamental root and branch change in American society, and that he himself died vilified and was assassinated. The violence got him in the end.
I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government.
Riots, they are polarizing, they are often hypermasculine, they are a response to a problem that they rarely in themselves solve. And yet, if you can think of no other way in which black people, in this instance, can live in a society without fear of what happened to George Floyd happening to them on a daily basis, then you have to ask yourself, well, what is the peace that reigned before? Violence as opposed to war?
You ask me, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all.
Violence is a part of America's culture. It is as American as cherry pie. American taught the black people to be violent.
And it's precisely because we are living under violence that there is always a chance that people may respond with violence. They elected a black president. That didn't do it. Black Lives Matter grew under a black president. The issue of whether black people can play basketball, football or baseball or dance or sing is not under question, but whether black people can live is a live question. So long as that is still a fundamental question, if it's not protested, then why would we think that anything would happen? Frederick Douglass, abolitionist from the 19th century, said power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. And these were the demands that weren't heard in every other forum. So when people refer to the destructive nature of the riots and rebellions, they first have to contemplate the destructive nature of what went before, but also the possibilities that are generally opened up by these moments. The black American middle class owes its existence to the uprisings of the 60s, which started as often but not uniquely peaceful civil rights protests led by the church and ended in the late 60s with pitched battles and tanks in the streets. That's why there's a black middle class. That's why Obama was even possible. Not because people behaved well, and when the police said move over to the sidewalk, they moved over to the sidewalk, and the police would put their dogs out. People didn't say, please let your dog bite me. That's not how it happened.
What happens? We begin to protest the oppressive conditions of black people, and when we protest it, it only shows the criminals where they are. They violate the very laws that are supposed to protect us. Why? We have to understand really what power is all about.
It's always important when one talks about violence to talk about violence in its entirety. So there is the violence of the rebellions. There's no point in pretending that some of that's not violent. Then there is the violence of the police force, the violence that actually in many ways precipitated this particular conflict. Then there is the violence of the economy, a violence that means that an African-American man in Washington, D.C. has a lower life expectancy than a man on the Gaza Strip. That too is violence. He's dying early. And then you have the more vicious, blatant violence of the state. So if we go back to the video of the woman in New York who threatens a black man with calling the police because she's got her dog off a leash and he's asked her to put her on a leash.
Please don't come close to me. Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life. I'm being threatened by a man in the Rambo. Please send the cops immediately.
What she does when she does that is she not only puts that man, Christian Cooper's, life in danger, she puts pretty much every other black man within a kind of 2-mile radius' life in danger. They will ask questions later. There may not be a later, as George Floyd found out. And so when you call the state, you expect violence. That's why she thought that he would shut up and go away. So it's not really plausible to understand the violence of these rebellions outside of the context of the broader violence that pervades, which is both the violence of the state, incarceration, arrests, disproportionate convictions and all that kind of stuff. Also the economic violence, which you rarely catch on camera. I think it's difficult to kind of ignore as well the impact of COVID-19. There are all these deaths that are taking place, far more deaths than the police could ever be responsible for, which are kind of not the brazen but the banal. People dying in their homes, dying for lack of healthcare, the economic violence of America and its racial composition showing up in these absolutely obscene disproportionalities between black and white deaths. And so there is a kind of cross-pollination between I can't breathe, one of the last sentences of George Floyd, and I can't breathe, the demands for respirators, the plight of the kind of black asthmatic, the range of ways in which black people are kind of falling in really large numbers in ways that don't get caught on video and that aren't shared and that remain kind of almost weirdly niche. That is extremely relevant because it speaks to the competence of the people who govern us. It speaks to their interest in working people, the speed with which they can get the National Guard on the ground, as opposed to the speed with which they could create tests and tracing and deliver PPE. Similarly, you can't understand racism and how it operates and its impulses without understanding capitalism. People aren't racist for fun. They're not even necessarily racist because they don't like black people. It's a form of control. It's a system of control. Trump didn't invent American racism. He's capitalized on it. He has fanned its flames, but he didn't invent it. He's a product of it. He is also desperate. He's flailing. As his base becomes smaller and smaller, he is forced to appeal in more and more naked terms to their basest instincts. In this case, the Bible, the gun and bigotry. You can elect fascists. Fascists don't necessarily just usurp power. Fascists don't turn up in fancy dress. They turn up as people offering you honour and to clean your streets and make everything right again. And this is effectively what we're seeing. In terms of him talking about domestic terrorism and denoting anti-fascist action or Antifa as a terrorist organisation, there are kind of parallels, if not precedents, for that in terms of how Peaceful King was understood as part of a communist conspiracy. It has often been the case that resisting racism makes you more suspect and more liable to the wrath of the American state than practicing it. It's not new. What's new, in effect, is post-civil rights era, taking that language full scale, lock, stock and barrel, taking it into the White House and then parading it from there. That's new. There was supposed to be some artifice. There was supposed to be a sleight of hand, a way of expressing racism through code. Welfare queens, crack babies. There were ways of subtly but clearly signifying with dog whistle politics who was in and who was out, why they were out, and so on. And what's happened more recently is we've gone from the dog whistle to the wolf whistle. Now there's no pretense. There is simply the bare enunciation and pronunciation of the bigotry itself.
Build that wall. Build that wall. Build that wall. Build that wall.
When I think about these latest protests, my hope resides in the fact that, first of all, they seem to be multiracial, which in America is no mean thing. It's a deeply residentially segregated country. The fact that there's been a cross-pollination of this across the globe, that it raises people's consciousness about what black people are living with all the time. And what one hopes is that we can connect that awareness to a broader awareness about what we're all living with all the time. So that whenever people are questioning capitalism, the state, or racial hierarchies, there's a chance. And that's where the hope resides. But it's not a passive hope. It has to be an active hope. Martin Luther King said the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. But it doesn't bend by itself. That's for us to put our shoulder to it and make it bend towards justice. This is one of many turning points. I would caution against any prediction or prognosis about where it's heading. The 60s ended up with Nixon. These things don't necessarily land the way we would like them to. There is a resurgence of inchoate left. There's also a resurgence of a very much better organized right. That right has been far more effective in seizing power, reaching its tentacles into existing parties and structures and taking them over than the left has been. The left has shown itself over the last 10 years since the last economic crisis to be really capable of clearing space, but not very good at holding it. I don't know that we are best positioned to take advantage of this situation actually, but we are in the battle for a narrative of this moment in the interests of working people, all of them, creating a broad understanding of what these rebellions are about, starting with the racial inequalities that led to this death and other deaths, but making it clear that most people who are killed by American cops are white. Black people are disproportionately killed, but they're not alone. It's white working class life expectancy that's falling because of drugs and drink and suicide, the deaths of despair. Connecting this moment, this broad, chaotic, polarizing, rebellious moment that's taking place in the US, connecting it with the kind of lives of people who aren't out there and for whom this is maybe not all obvious. That, you know, so we got work to do. We've got a lot of work to do. If you want to hear alternative voices, then you have to support the kind of people that are broadcasting them. Double Down News doesn't have any big backers, doesn't take ads, so if you want to support it, subscribe to Patreon and give them some money. Join the future of journalism, join Double Down News on Patreon.
Well, there's so much in that. I'm glad that we could share that together. And again, we could spend the entire rest of our time discussing it, although of course discussion is not really feasible in this format. Here are some notes that I took about it as I was watching it with you again. One of the things that I'm sure you immediately noticed about Gary Young is that he speaks with a British accent because he grew up in the United Kingdom, I think specifically in London. And he's a part of the Black diaspora that, in this case, went to the mother country. I could say something else if we were not, if we were not like doing a video that will be seen elsewhere, but let's just call it the mother country, which is of course the United Kingdom, Britain, Great Britain, England. And that's what happened with the former British colonies after World War II. I've been to the United Kingdom on a number of occasions and met Black activists, including Black feminists and Black lesbian feminist activists there. And the United Kingdom, as does most of Europe, now has populations of people of color and also has their own particular kind of racism and racial issues. In fact, white nationalism is rampant there, and what goes on here that Gary Young talks so eloquently about with the current administration is absolutely tied to the white nationalism and proto-fascism that is occurring all over Europe. He started by talking about how riots are justified because people are responding to being treated as nothing and being annihilated. Just imagine if white people were summarily slaughtered in the way that Black people have been for more than 4 centuries here. What level of rage would white people feel? And yet, it's white people who feel the need and feel motivated to kill us. That's one of the things that I think of. I haven't quite written about it yet. I don't know that I will, but it's a thought process that I have when I think about these issues, which is the irony that the people who are doing the violence and terrorizing a group of people are not the people who have been oppressed, but it's the oppressors. So, you know, what are they so upset about? You know, they're upset about the fact that we exist. We are a reminder of the horrific history of the United States, and during enslavement and certainly afterwards, nothing but violently enforced racial oppression and even less than second-class citizenship by those who have benefited from racism. There's some irony there. But as I said, imagine how angry white people would be if police officers and others, vigilantes, treated their loved ones the way our loved ones are treated on a 24/7 daily basis for centuries. The fact that the issue of so-called rioting is being discussed now, it has gotten into the conversation about the next presidential and soon to happen presidential election. And there's this characterization, you know, the way that the protests are characterized, just baloney. It's complete and utter baloney, because most of the protests that happen are indeed not violent, and they don't get covered. He asked the question, can Black people live? That's what we're trying to establish. The jury's still out on that, particularly the white, all white, not jury of your peers jury. Can Black people live in a place called the United States? Just live, not run Fortune 500 companies or live next to you, but just live. Although we should be allowed to do those two things, we would really like to be able just to live. He talks about that, he mentioned that the reason that there's a Black middle class at this time, and even a small Black upper class, is because of the rebellions and uprisings of the 1960s. And that's an interesting way to think about that. It's an accurate way to think about it. What you got with Gary Young's wonderful presentation, so clear, so analytical, so accessible, is that what you got is somebody who has a political analysis. He is a person who identifies as a leftist, and he is anti-capitalist, clearly, and he's anti-racist, and he's also opposed to gender and sexuality oppression. So he has all those things going on simultaneously, and there's a clarity that you get when you have an analysis like that. You have to read and study to get it, and you also have to work with people who share that kind of analysis. Having said that, this is a perfect example of his way of looking at reality and what's going on socially and economically and politically. He talks about the violence of the economy, and that economic violence, which is seldom, that economic violence is seldom on screen. So the thousands of people in Los Angeles who sleep in tents on the streets, I saw that with my own eyes a few years ago. When I went there, I had no idea that there's sections of Los Angeles that look like it might be like a campground, or maybe there's a music festival that's going to happen and people are camping. No, it's homeless people and their many colored tents living outdoors. That's the kind of thing that seldom gets any media play. He talked about incarceration and showed incarceration. He also talked about how white working class and working poor people are not doing that well either, and talked about the epidemic of the opioid epidemic and the despair that is embodied in the high rate of dependence on those drugs, an addiction to those drugs, and also the overdoses and the suicides that are essentially suicides, and then actual other kinds of suicides. He said that you can't understand racism without understanding capitalism. He talked about how previously there was some artifice with our federal administrations, our presidential administrations. There were dog whistle politics. He said nowadays we have wolf whistle politics. So that's where we are. Just a second, I'm going to take a sip of water. So I'm going to turn now to an article that you were supposed to have read for this session. And that's an article by Elie Mystal. It is titled, The Inevitable White Lash Against Racial Justice Has Started. It's from The Nation, currently my favorite magazine, since I don't think that I said this, or I may not even have known it the last time we met, but my article about the Hamer-Baker plan to eradicate white supremacy is the lead editorial in the magazine of The Nation, because not everything that's online gets into the magazine. So imagine how thrilled I was that not only was that article chosen to be in the magazine, but it's the lead editorial in the magazine that is going to be available quite soon. I think people who have subscriptions will see it perhaps in the this week. And someone who I know who lives elsewhere had gone to a bookstore, and the previous issue was still there. So you can look for it. It's a much shorter version than what is online. So the only reason you would look for it is just to share my great ecstasy at having gotten there. Writers have dreams. I'm a writer who has dreams. We continue to have dreams. But as I said, it's a much shorter version. But it's quite an honor that the oldest continually publishing weekly magazine in the United States, founded by abolitionists in 1865, that they would choose to have that piece where it is positioned in the magazine. I guess I must be onto something about what we need to do about white supremacy. So I'm going to read you some paragraphs from Elie Mystahl's piece. And the reason I chose this one for you, besides its great content, is because his anger about what is going on here is absolutely front and center and palpable. And I think it's really important for people to understand, if you want to understand white supremacy and understand the impact of white supremacy on people of color, specifically on Black people, he is Black, that you understand the level of rage and anger that we have to deal with on, again, a daily basis because of how we're treated, what we have to live under, and just how absolutely trying and debilitating it is to be treated in the ways that we are. And this spring and summer has shown that with in no uncertain terms. So these are just some paragraphs from his much longer article. Now comes a part, this is the opening paragraph though. Now comes a part where white people abandon us. Now comes a part where the white majority impatiently demands a return to normalcy. Now comes the part where white people say, quote, I believe that Black lives matter, but, end quote. Now comes the part where white people start literally telling Black people to stop protesting because some bad people are also protesting. And I knew that white people would eventually find a way to blame Black people for making them not care about us. Because not every Black person brutalized by the cops can go out like George Floyd. In many ways, Floyd was a perfect victim for white America. Floyd didn't die quickly. He was subdued in a non-threatening, and that's in quotes, non-threatening position for 8 minutes and 46 seconds while he died. He died pleading for his life. He died calling out to his mother, who is dead. He was calling out to his mother as he was being murdered, and his mother is dead. But of course, you go back to default. When you're in danger, when you're in misery, when you're afraid, who do you think of? Of course, it's your mother. So he's calling out for his dead mother, and then he's dead. That's how white people like us to die, face down begging. They don't like us to die on our feet. They don't like us to die trying to get away. They certainly don't like us to die while trying to defend ourselves. Jacob Blake was not the perfect victim for white people. To complete the narrative that Blake was a dangerous criminal, the police chained Blake. Now remember, he was shot 7 times. He's paralyzed. To complete the narrative that Blake was a, quote, dangerous criminal, end quote, the police chained Blake to his hospital bed by his legs that no longer work because the cops paralyzed him from the waist down. 7 bullets into your back will do that. That's my, marginal note. He'll never be able to walk away from the cops again. Elie explains that he does not have a choice whether to pay attention to what is happening racially, because he has 2 sons and a family to protect. So it's not like, oh, I'll think about this or not think about this. He points out in a section that follows what I just read that he doesn't have a choice about that. Neither do I. Neither do any Black people. We have to think about this stuff all the time. We have to calculate all the time, every move. And if you don't think that I have to calculate as an older Black woman, think again. White people blaming Black people, white people blaming Black people for the horrors white people inflict upon Black people is as American as apple pie. And in the video that we just watched with Gary Young, he had it included H. Rap Brown, one of the Black Panther leaders, saying a very famous quote at the time that was repeated and repeated and repeated, that violence and racism in the United States is as American as cherry pie. Whatever kind of pie it is dead up American. White people have a lot of thoughts on the proper way for Black folks to die. Where they come up short is imagining a society that allows Black people to live in peace without harassment and brutality from the police or any other white guy with a gun. Essentially, the months after Floyd's murder have been a summer fling for a majority of white people. It's like they went on safari in Ghana, saw some lions, had sex with a Black person who works there, and learned a lot about the transatlantic slave trade. But now playtime's over, and the white majority has to get back to the serious work of enforcing white supremacy and privilege and re-electing a bigoted president. If you thought Floyd's murder was going to lead to structural change, then you don't know white people as well as I do. As I said, I chose that because it is a great and beautifully written article that reflects unsparingly the anger that we feel. And if you don't know his work, you should find it, because he is so creative. He has great insight. I'm pretty sure he's an attorney and writes about legal issues. He's a regular writer and contributor to The Nation. And he also has a scorching sense of humor, which is something that we often have as oppressed people, because that's one of the ways that we get through all this. So I want you to think about what I just read, and I also want you to read the entire article. One of the things I will suggest to you, since this is our last session, is that number one, you read and or look at all of the resources that have been recommended. Chris has done a great job of compiling all the things that I sent to him. They are available to you, that you read all those things and that you do it in a collective fashion, that you have a study group, you know, an XR study group, another kind of study group. If you're not a part of XR, you deal with those resources that I have provided. They're a good start. I mean, they are by no means definitive. They are by no means all that you should read, but you certainly should read the ones that the things that I've already recommended and go on from there. Now I'm going to read from another piece that you were asked to read for this webinar. And that's an article by a dear friend of mine whose name is Jamie Grant. And the name of the article, the title of the article is 9 Reasons Why Acting in Solidarity for Racial Justice is Preferable to Allyship. 9 reasons why acting in solidarity for racial justice is preferable to allyship. I met Jamie Grant in the late 80s when she was in graduate school at Bucknell. And she invited me to speak there. I'd recently moved to upstate New York, and I remember going there, I think it was in the fall. And we've been friends ever since the late 1980s. She is a white Irish-American woman whose family lived in the Boston area, and she was doing research about the murder of 12 Black women that occurred in a few months, in a 4-month period in 1979. I lived in Boston during the 1970s, during the race war in Boston of the 1970s because of school desegregation. And I certainly was very, very involved, centrally involved in the organizing that the Combahee River Collective did around the murders of 12 Black women. And that's what Jamie was working on. As I said, we've been friends ever since. And her son is now, she had no son at that time, of course, because that was the 1980s. He is now a junior in college, and her daughter is, I guess, in 8th grade. I don't know how these things happen. I don't know why these children, these babies, I don't know how they get so big and how it goes so fast. But anyway, Jamie and I have been lifetime friends. So this article is really helpful. She has a list of 9 suggestions. I'm only going to read you some of them. But that thing about allies and what you can do more and better than being an ally, we talked about that previously. I know that we talked about that previously. She talks about solidarity, which is a tried and true bedrock of any political movement and struggle. Solidarity forever. The union makes us strong. Solidarity is so important. And if you don't think you know what solidarity is, look it up. It is standing with people whose interests you share, but whose identities and oppression you may not. You don't have to be on strike yourself at a factory. You don't have to be killed and people in your community killed on a regular basis by the police to be in solidarity. So that's what solidarity is. But the other words that I like, and I think I've offered those to you previously, are being a co-conspirator or being an accessory. And those are very active things to be. Accessories and co-conspirators are acting. So she writes in her suggestion number 3, allies often focus on the interpersonal. Solidarity actions work to dismantle structures. I'm going to repeat that one. Allies often focus on the interpersonal. Solidarity actions work to dismantle structures. And I would say, same thing, systems. Her 5th recommendation is allyship is heavy on talk. Solidarity is action. 7, allyship is a, quote, gift, end quote. Solidarity is a responsibility. And I think I shared in the first session what Edward Ball said about the fact that his family had been one of the largest slave-owning families in the United States during the antebellum period. I think they were in South Carolina. And Harry Gross asked him, do you feel responsible for what your family did? They had enslaved hundreds of people and made a huge, huge, huge fortune that made him wealthy to this very day on the backs of enslaved Africans. And Harry Gross on Fresh Air asked him, do you feel responsible for what your family did? And he said, no, I don't feel responsible, but I do feel accountable. And that is getting toward the same kind of consciousness that Jamie is writing about. And she continues, I watch a lot of allies waiting around for their gold star, their moment in the sun for having done something, quote, above and beyond, end quote, the call of duty. A lot of these activists complain that people of color aren't immediately excited or warm to them in activist spaces. And here you get into how to desegregate your life and desegregate your organizing. Expect that you're not necessarily going to be greeted with, you know, the fatted lamb and or the fatted calf and, you know, whatever people do when they celebrate your presence. The fatted tofu. People working in solidarity understand that we carry the history of white supremacy in our bodies and our faces. There's no reason on earth to trust white peers in racial justice work. Repeat that. I will repeat that. There is no reason on earth to trust white peers in racial justice work. Remember, this is a white woman who wrote this. There are no cookies for showing up. There's something. Vegan cookies, right? There are no cookies for showing up. We may not get invited to the celebration party afterwards, where our peers of color might need a people of color only space to download and support each other. Excuse me. The reward is the opportunity to do something meaningful to counter a violent order that was built to serve our interests. Excuse me for a moment. This is number 9. Allied work generally does not redistribute resources. Solidarity means that we intentionally work to redistribute the ill-gotten gains of racism: jobs, schools, neighborhoods, housing, healthcare, and capital, just like Edward Ball said. I want you to think about what are the most pressing manifestations of racist oppression where you live now, today. Can you name 3 examples of racial oppression that are front and center and ongoing? And after you name them, which of these issues have you done anything to challenge and change other than attending Black Lives Matter protests this summer? That's my challenging question to you. Number 1, do you know what's going on around racial oppression where you live? I know a lot of people live in Troy. A lot of stuff going on in Troy. If you live in Albany, we all live in the or most of us live in the capital region, although I understand there are people who are joining us who are not from here. But wherever you live, racism and white supremacy are just quickly peddling on its path, on that nasty path that it has been peddling on ever since first contact. So do you have any idea of 3 things that are going on racially where you live? Can you name them? And after you do that, what have you done in relationship to challenging or changing those things, in addition to and besides going to Black Lives Matter protests? So here's some of my advice now for how to desegregate your life, and therefore desegregate your organizing. Number 1, have knowledge of people of color. And I'm into the teacherly mode, not always in my teacherly mode, but today particularly. So I'm repeating things, particularly since I can't see you, because like if you're in a group setting with people, you can kind of see when stuff is registered or not. And since I'm just looking at my screen here, I feel the need to repeat. And of course, repeating information is a common way to convey it with clarity. So number 1, have knowledge of people of color. You can do that through books. I already recommended that you read all the books and all the articles and websites. Go to all the websites that are in the list that you receive. And you can also go much farther afield than that. There are 2 institutions that I want to call to your attention. One is the Schomburg Center for Research on Black Culture, a part of the New York Public Library system at 135th. Can't remember the avenue. I don't want to say it incorrectly, so I won't. But it's in Harlem. the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which is the largest repository of material about people of African heritage in the world. And it's interesting because the second place I'm going to call to your attention is the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., which only opened a few years ago. And I don't know if, I doubt seriously that the existence of the Smithsonian Museum has changed the status of the Schomburg as far as a repository of research materials, because the Schomburg is a research center and on some levels a library, although not a lending library. And the museum in Washington is a repository of artifacts and an educational institution in that way. So they're not primarily collecting research and research materials at the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. And although the Schomburg does indeed have some artifacts and a gallery space, that's not their primary mission. Now, the reason I bring these two institutions up is that they represent in many ways the scope of what could be learned if one decided to try to learn it. These are huge buildings, particularly the Smithsonian, but these are sizable buildings that are full of information and material. And one of the things about the Schomburg, I don't know who's been to the Schomburg, but if you ever get an opportunity to go, do be aware that most of their holdings are not on site. So what you see when you're on the several floors of the Schomburg in New York City, that's not their entire collection by any means. It's a fraction of their collection. So as I said, these two buildings represent what could be learned if one decided that that was important to learn it. And they physically embody all that you probably and perhaps do not know. That's one of the things, as a person whose profession is teaching African American studies, it's one of the things I try to convey to people who may, like myself, because I never really had a course in African American studies. I had one course, a seminar on Richard Wright, which was just a lucky fluke because I went to grad school in '69 and there's no way you could study African American literature in any graduate school in the United States at that time. I went to graduate school in so-called English and studied British and American literature. So, because I knew in college, I knew as I finished college that what I wanted to do with my life was to teach African American literature. So I went to grad school and read every dead white man there probably is, whoever wrote in English, all of them. Dryden, Donne, you name it, I read them. Wordsworth, you name them. And my goal, though, was to teach African American literature, and I'm in the generation of Black scholars who actually instituted Black studies in the United States. That's the generation I'm a part of. But as I said, I try to convey to people in our age group, whatever our race, did not necessarily have that opportunity, would not have had that opportunity. I want people to understand the scope because people see one movie, they watch one documentary, they read one book by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and they think they're there. And that's not the case. Two, have appreciation. The second thing is to have appreciation of people of color. That is one of the reasons I did the quiz for the first session. And maybe, Chris, you could put the quiz up on the screen now. I wanted people to understand a few things about what's going on with us that they might not have given thought to, and how much attention do people pay to the lives of people of color. Even well-meaning white people usually think of Black people as inferior on some level. Repeat, even well-meaning white people usually think of Black people as inferior on some level. We are damaged by the pain and hurt of being oppressed. Well, really? Black people need white people's help. Being an ally, as Jamie Grant points out, puts you in that helping mode. Very seldom do white people understand that all white organizations are actually substantively inferior to integrated ones. People of color need to be treated as peers. Also, for God's sake, learn something that is not superficial about Black history and culture. I just talked about that at length. How white people relate to Black people specifically, that is different from how they relate to other people of color because of the history of enslavement. I am a Black person. I can't really talk about the experiences of other people of color, but I have observed that white people do indeed have different kinds of relationships with different kinds of people of color, depending on what their heritage and origins are. And that has everything to do with whether they were enslaved or not. It was people of African heritage who were enslaved here, and that's why we have the lowest status to this day, and it's also why we are the targets of such egregious violence to this day. In the 1980s, I was talking to someone, a white woman, a feminist, a lesbian, just to kind of position her as far as her consciousness and what were influences upon her consciousness. And she was someone who was very, very involved in the Central America Solidarity movement. And I was delivering some books to her from Kitchen Table Women of Color Press that she was going to get to, I don't know if it was Nicaragua or if it was El Salvador, but she was planning on a trip. And I don't think it was Cuba because it's very hard to travel to Cuba at that time. But people were going back and forth to these countries that the United States was destabilizing through internecine, if that's the right way to pronounce it, warfare. And so I'm bringing the books to her, and she was talking to me. This is somebody I'd known for a little while, and she said, "Oh, Barbara," she said, "you really need to go, to Central America, whichever country she was talking about." He said, "The people are just so incredible. I've never met people like this." And she described their wonderful characteristics, how warm they were, all kinds of wonderful things about them. And I just stood there and listened to her. And she, she conveyed that she believed that they were absolutely unique and very different from people in the United States. And I told her, at least I think I told her, in my imagination I told her, but I certainly thought this as she was speaking, that she could actually get on the A train, the subway, to Harlem, and she would find people who had the exact same qualities that she had just described. But because of Blackness and anti-Black racism, of course, most white people don't think of us as being those wonderful, incredibly resilient, with a rich culture and, like really great family values and ingenuity and, and kindness and forbearance. And they don't think of us that way because we're Black and we live in the United States. So there you have that. This is number 3, relate to people of color as peers, not as inferiors or objects of charity. When I was teaching at the College of St. Rose in the early 2000s, I was concerned about where they were around racial and social justice. And I was informed that they had an annual trip that they took their first year students on, I think before school started or shortly after school started. They had an annual trip that they took these students on to Washington, D.C. so that they could volunteer at a soup kitchen and probably a homeless shelter. And as I said, Washington, D.C. I was so not pleased when I heard that, because that's not about social justice. That's about charity. And what possibly did those students learn, except that they were superior to the poor people they were helping? We have in our area, as you probably know, an annual Thanksgiving dinner. It's a huge Thanksgiving dinner. I'm not naming the institution. You all who live here know what it is. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of people in the Capital Region who are convinced that they are not racist because they have a family tradition for generations, because it's of some years, decades duration now, so it can be more than one generation of a family that participates. They think they're not racist because they have a family tradition of volunteering at that Thanksgiving dinner, because of course, nobody really needs food on any other day except for Thanksgiving and Christmas. You know, that random April 22nd, you don't really need to be bothered with those people. It's all, I think it's really good that there are people who volunteer to feed people, to provide sustenance for people who otherwise would not have that. But what I would like to see is people working to end the system that makes people poor to begin with. I don't know, I'm funny that way. The fourth thing about segregated lives. When I first moved to Albany in the mid-1980s and would attend all white political events, or almost entirely white political events, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 people of color with an audience of 30, 50, 100. And these were primarily events around Central America, solidarity, organizing. I realized that the reason the events were all white is that the supposedly progressive white people at them had no meaningful relationships with people of color. The fear of people of color. And I know that I went way into the time that I hope that we would have questions and answers. I'm going to try to conclude soon. As I said, you know, this is at least a semester's worth of material, if not a whole year, if not a whole lifetime. But that thing about like not having people of color in your life, if you have people of color in your life, if you're going to an interesting film, lecture, etc., you might say to the people of color in your life, oh, I'm going to X place, I'm going to Y place. Do you think you might be interested in going? That would be fun. It'd be really fun if we could go together. I'd love that. But because people live segregated lives, they don't have like an array of like, or even maybe one person of color that they would invite to do something in non-work time, during non-work hours. So hence, you have then a room full of people, none of whom who apparently have any real connections to people of color. And so then when they all show up at the wonderful film about what's going on in El Salvador, oops, it's all white. I have problems with that, as you know. I can't possibly tell you about all the things that happened in the women's movement to address racism. I think that was one of the questions last time. Is there any movement that I know of that seriously took on addressing desegregation? And I can say, oh yes, the feminist movement of the 1970s, that would have been the second wave of the women's movement, in which I was a very, very involved participant, to put it mildly. We took that on. It happened because there were women of color in the movement who pushed white women who were in the movement to examine their racism, to change their practices, to do something about it. One of the reasons I believe it worked in the women's movement, differently perhaps from some other movements, is that we were in each other's personal lives. And that is particularly relevant when you consider that a lot of us were lesbians. So the fact that we had a movement, you know, the feminist movement, there is a lesbian feminist component of that women's movement that was often the most progressive wing of the women's movement, including socialist feminists who were lesbians. We actually had a personal connection and a spirit and a reality of sisterhood that was much more real and operational than perhaps it being an intellectual conclusion if you are part of white male dominated organizing. We actually had bonds with each other. Some of them were personal, some of them were based upon how we were defining feminism at the time. So there was, I think, a little more readiness and openness of like, no, we don't want our sisters to be marginalized. We don't want our sisters to be just, you know, pushed to the side. We don't want them to be experiencing racism or unconscious, unexamined racism. There were people, not all, by no means all, the mainstream white women's movement of that period, they weren't about it. They were not about it. But I was not involved in the mainstream white women's movement of that period. I was involved in the leading edge of the movement that has given you the politics you practice today. The women's movement did so much politically in the United States to change movement culture, movement priorities, movement definitions and understandings, and also life as we know it. You know, whenever you go to a physician at this time, some of the things that do and do not happen to you that would have been insulting, demeaning, just completely wrong. One of the reasons, a major reason they don't happen is because of feminist organizing. And you can DM me or whatever. Chris knows how to be in contact with me, as does Dorothy, if you want to hear more about that. In 1979, I spoke at the first conference of the National Women's Studies Association. Women's Studies was just beginning then. This was the first national conference of the National Women's Studies Association in Lawrence, Kansas. I don't remember what they asked me to talk about, probably Black women something, but I decided that I would talk about racism and women's studies. That article, some people consider it to be a classic. In that article, I define what feminism is, and it's a very inclusive, intersectional definition, at least around 10 years before intersectionality was ever conceptualized. Let's see, after that was 79, in 1981, the National Women's Studies Association decided that it would focus every one of its conferences during that year on probably the academic year, given that they were, you know, that we were and they were academics, like, so it'd be the 80 to 81 academic year. And the conference was always in June, like kind of end of the school year. That they decided that every one of their conferences, including the main conference and the regional conferences, would focus on racism. So I lived in Boston at that time, as I mentioned. We had a regional New England Women's Studies Association conference affiliated with the national, and that conference focused on racism. The huge national conference was at the University of Connecticut at Storrs. That's where I happen to have worked on my not completed doctorate, but that's just, you know, FYI. But it was a campus that was familiar to me, and boy, was it transformed with thousands of women, primarily women from all over the United States, who were talking about racism. This Bridge Call My Back, a pivotal work for you to read. This Bridge Call My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color, co-edited by Cherie Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa, had just been published. And there was a huge This Bridge Call My Back reading at that 1981 conference. In the meantime, people were doing things like developing consciousness-raising guidelines around racism. People were desegregating their organizations, which sometimes function as businesses, like women's bookstores, women's restaurants, feminist health centers. Yes, we had our own health centers during those years where non-sexist, respecting of women health was practiced, and very self-empowered, because there's a lot you can do for yourself. Yeah, self-care was not invented in the last couple of months or years. But as I said, a battered women's shelter, Kamehi was invited to do a racism workshop at Transition House, which was the second battered women's shelter open in the United States. It was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the Boston area. We agreed that we would do that. We were the kind of Black women, the kind of Black feminists who, when asked by other feminists if we would talk to them about racism, we didn't say, sure, why not? We thought, I wonder how that's going to go. But we did it. We did it. I can't even get into all the interventions, but it was ongoing, and for some of us, it was constant, and it has never ended. There were special issues of publications, some of which I edited myself, certainly contributed to some of those. So there was a whole full court press to desegregate a movement. And that's still an ongoing process, but it's a unique history, and it's a history that is basically not written down anywhere. There are very few citations I could give to you of where to read that history, because of course the mainstream is not going to let you know that history. People are much more interested in what's that phrase, leaning in. Yeah, they're much more interested in leaning in or in knowing your value, as Mika Brzezinski on MSNBC talks about. So I've taught far long enough. Let us try to get to some comments and questions before our time together is over.
All right, so I'm gonna activate the raised hand feature. Everyone can now raise their hand to ask a question. Once you do, I'm gonna switch you over to a panelist status so you can unmute your mic and you can activate your camera so that you can be seen and heard. So if you highlight your Zoom window, you should be able to see the raise hand feature now. I don't see any hands going up right now. Dorothy or Sienna, could you, oh, we got one hand. Let's go in there. All right, if you could unmute your mic and activate your camera, please.
I think I've got the mic on.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. There's the camera. Hello. Barbara, I tried to hang back, but it looked like you needed somebody to start the questioning.
Go figure.
Sorry. You mentioned the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Yes.
And I, in exploring their website, came across their talking about race section that I don't know if you've looked at, and I'm not competent to assess it. So if it seems like a very deep, multi-layered program of information, history, and contemporary culture. You have any opinion about it?
I did not hear the word you said when you were describing it. There was one word you said, it was about race, and then I could not hear that word. What is it about?
The section of the museum's website is titled "Talking About Race."
Oh, talking about race. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, I thought I'd missed a word. Since I haven't seen it, I can't possibly assess, whether it's of value or not. I'll just say this: as a charter contributor to the museum, I'm talking about pennies here, but as a charter, that's a lot of people get a lot of pennies from me, actually.
Your pennies and ours.
But in any event, as a charter contributor to the museum, there is nothing that I've seen them do that doesn't have great value and great educational impact and content. Sadly, I have not been to the museum, ironically enough. I was in Washington. The last time I was in Washington was a few days, literally a few days before it opened. And you can check back, I want to say 2016, I'm not quite sure. But as I said, that's the last time I was in Washington. I actually thought I would get there again this spring because my favorite organization from the civil rights movement, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, every so often they will have reunion conferences that are very political conferences. And there was going to be one in Washington in April. And I registered like October or November. I even reserved my hotel room. That's how deeply into going I was. And if I had gone, I would have gone to the museum, but then we know what happened subsequently. So as I said, there's just a, I don't know what word to use, like a cornucopia of incredible material about the subject matter that we've been discussing for the last few weeks. I have recommended the Zen Education Project. I love what they do. I mentioned teaching tolerance for the pre-K through 12 grades, despite the mistaken, their mistaken name. And so there are lots and lots and lots and lots of resources. I think one of the things I would say is point of view. Gary Young gave us, and so did Elie Mystal, they give us a point of view about the subject matter and the content that is very, very important to have if it's going to have its maximum meaning. And the bland, you know, everything is everything perspective, that never got it for me. And I don't think that that's the most incisive learning or source of material, but I think that I can't imagine that that's not a useful resource. And thank you, Leo.
Thank you. And we don't have to travel to Washington to access the museum, fortunately.
Not during this time, but there's nothing like being with the objects. My joke when it opened and people were telling me about it is that I just wanted to have a little cot in the basement of the museum so I could sleep there. And then I could go every day, you know, like for maybe a week or so. Every day I could leave my little closet, you know, where the cot was, and I could like just immerse myself in the museum. There's nothing like the real thing. Let's try to get a couple more questions in.
I know you, Barbara, well enough that you would be wandering the museum in the middle of the night, not waiting for the morning to get out of your cot.
Yeah, and they're really going to let me have a cot there too. Anyway,
listen, I'm gonna get out of the way. It looks like
I would love to get some more questions in.
Good.
Thank you so much.
All right, next up we have Megan.
Hi, Barbara. My camera's not working, so even if I try to turn it on. But my question for you is, in thinking about the Nation article, I know a lot of people felt hope that this wave of protest was going to be different, that white America had been hit in a way that, you know, there was a new realization of just how horrific the race war in America has been. So I guess my question is, in thinking about the two-party system in America and the fact that a lot of other countries, you can run as an independent, you know, by only getting a couple of signatures. And in this country, you need, you know, tens of thousands of signatures to run as an independent. Do you feel like if we really were able to, that part of the political apathy or the way that like things arise and then people go back to the status quo, which is the racist status quo. But do you think that if we were able to essentially just have more parties and that the Democrats and the Republicans didn't control the entire game of politics in America, that your vision of how we could change these systems would be different?
That's a really great question. And I didn't know exactly what the end of the question, where it would conclude. But yes, I was already formulating my comment and then you got to exactly what I would suggest and say. which is we really need to have alternatives to the two parties that we have. And not only an alternative, we need to have something that's a counterforce. We've never been able to build that kind of a party, and I've not done research myself on the history of third parties in the United States. So I can't tell you about every single effort that has been made, but we have never been able to mobilize to a point of holding federal power. I think that in Minnesota, that their Democratic Party, their state Democratic Party is the Democratic, what is it, the Democratic Social Democrats. I'm not saying the name correctly, I'm so sorry. But they actually have been able to develop a more progressive party in the state of Minnesota. But what we have here, it's funny you should mention, is the Working Families Party. And the Working Families Party is across the United States. It's not in every state, but it is here. And the Working Family Party at this point is under great attack because of the fact that a person who lives kind of down the street, a few blocks away in a place called the Governor's Mansion, he has put roadblocks up that require, I guess probably all third parties or all smaller parties but this affects, as I said, the Working Families Party, the one that I'm concerned about, that there's a much higher threshold for people voting on the Working Family Party's ballot line for them to maintain the ballot line. So we're looking at the possibility of not being able to vote WFP in New York State if we don't get enough signatures. And I'm not making a endorsement. I can say honestly, though, that when I ran for office, both times I was endorsed myself by the WFP. So there is a relationship there, but that's just an example, that a real concrete example of what you're asking about. And I don't know that a third party, a successful left of center party in the United States doesn't necessarily guarantee an end to white supremacy and racism. Depends on what the politics of the party are. But it would certainly give us something to work with that we don't have with the parties that exist. That's my perspective on the matter, and thanks for asking that.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you. So I have a question for people. What have you learned about white supremacy that you did not know before we started this? If anybody wants to take that on. But I'm quite willing to answer any questions that people had before I asked that.
We do have John Johansson with a question.
Hi, I hope you can all see and hear me. Okay, good.
We've met.
I think we met, right? Kind of, oh yeah, sorry, we met at an XR meeting some months ago.
Yes.
See you again. I've noticed, I think, as like a white person engaging in this, I think there's a lot of effort that goes into like, where can I be involved, and how can I educate myself and these things, and sort of to some degree done some of that work, but I see a lot of specific asks for resources, like in the article about allyship versus solidarity. It's like we don't necessarily need your participation. Sometimes it's actually somewhat complicated, and like in a lot of ways we just need money. So we need jobs and these very like tangible things. And in my experience, I haven't seen a lot of, or I'm wondering if you have any guidance on how to go about like deciding where to give money to, or if you have specific recommendations, or how you'd recommend going through a process of like, if we want to direct resources somewhere. It seems like from the perspective of someone interested in that sort of operation, it's hard to know where to start, I guess. And I feel like it's not talked about that much. So I'm just curious if you have any suggestions in terms of how to initiate that process for oneself, like how to begin that journey.
Right.
any specific recommendations on like good conduits for resources that
Right,
you've come
indeed. That's a great question. And I'm wondering, are you talking about locally? Are you talking about nationally, or both?
You know, it's funny, actually, there were two questions that I was thinking of asking, and you're kind of touching on the second one, which is, I don't know. And that's a deep question. I mean, is national, you know, in some ways I'm driven personally to act more locally. It just feels, you know, but I'm not sure if that's just because of my local comfort, you know, is national more important, or is the local level more important, or, you know. So yeah, I'm just curious about your input.
Right. I think that's complicated. And on a national level, the first organization entity that comes to mind for me is Resist. Resist is a radical, I don't know if they even call themselves a foundation, but they've existed since I think 1967. And some of the leading voices in the movement to end the war in Vietnam. I'm thinking of Noam Chomsky. I think Howard Zinn was connected to Resist. They started Resist back then to fund the peace anti-war efforts of a very, very vibrant movement. And they have kept up with it since 1967. And they only fund grassroots organizations, and there are organizations here in the Capital Region that have received grants from Resist. I think I don't want to get too far into local organizations, because I think I got, you know, because of the question that Megan asked about parties, you know, it was very top of mind for me, because I had just become aware of what was going on with the Working Families Party as an example of a third party that actually is effective, because it can run candidates and support candidates that are not necessarily a part of the Democratic establishment, although sometimes it's not always the case. But I felt like, oh my goodness, I'm making it sound like this is what people should do. And I think I did my little disclaimers, but I don't really want to get into like who to support locally. I'll instead talk about like characteristics of organizations that you might wish to support. I think that it would be important for them to have a proactive political organizing model as opposed to a charity model. As I said, when Leo and I were conversing, I was saying how I contributed to and still do, to the museum in Washington, the African American History and Culture Museum, and that I give a lot of pennies to a lot of different places. I've done that for years. I've never had very much money and have had challenges supporting myself. That's why there's a Barbara Smith Caring Circle, which has allowed me to retire and write these fire-breathing articles for the Globe and the Nation. Thank you very much. But in any event, as I said, I think that characteristics of being action-oriented organizations, people of color-led organizations, organizations working on issues that have positive impact on the community of people of color. We can talk about this offline. I know that will be easy for us to connect, and then I would perhaps make some suggestions around local organizations. But just one more thing. There are groups and organizations and individuals and articles and things to read about how to do socially responsible philanthropy. There's some people who have lots of money, and I'm thinking of a particular Disney, you know, offspring, who has given a huge amount of money to many, many organizations in a really conscious way. And as I said, you're not the only person who's thinking about this kind of thing. There's an Estrella Foundation in New York City, which was founded as the first lesbian foundation in the country. But like anything that's lesbian feminist, it funds multi-issue initiatives. So, as I said, we have progressive. So sorry about that. We have progressive foundations, and we have organizations, and we can talk more about this. But the fact that you're thinking along those lines is very positive. And thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have Zoom rooms set up for this?
For the meet and greet afterwards?
Yes.
Yes, we do have one
Okay.
set up. I can put that in the chat.
Yeah, I don't know if people, I don't think that's been mentioned up until now, so I don't know if people knew that that was an option. I guess anybody who's still on would perhaps be open to being in a Zoom room. It is 6 minutes after 5, and I had a whole fantasy. Is there anyone else who has a hand raised, Chris?
Yes, we have 2 folks with their hands raised. I know
Okay,
you have,
I would like to get to those 2 people. Indulge me, please. I would like to get to those 2 people, and then we'll conclude. And of course, if you have to leave, that's of course your option.
all right, let's see. We have Henry. Henry, if you could turn your mic and video on.
Hello, can you hear me?
Your voice is very soft.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, my mic isn't working. I mean, my camera isn't. I want to start developing more relationships with people of color, but usually I would do that at school or something, and I can't go anywhere right now. How should I like navigate that if I can't really leave the house as much?
I would, I know this is the default, that we fall back on. I would look at social media. I don't know that you're going to really actually form relationships with people via social media. People you don't know, but there's some, like what I found being, like completely immersed in Twitter as I am, that there's some people who I follow on Twitter that I have, we seem to have an affinity for each other. And like there's a person who I've been following for some time, and his Twitter handle is y'all don't read, and I've always loved that, because I just thought, yeah, just tell them about it, tell them, they need to know that they need to be reading. And so we were doing some socializing, as they call it, around my Nation article early last week, and he received a DM about the article coming out. So we've been having these nice little exchanges via DM. Nothing of substance by any means, but I think that one of the things that happens with social media is that you get exposed to voices of people who you're drawn to and who you're interested in what they have to say. And at this point of time, that's about the best I think that you can do, because we are so hampered. You talk about being in school, and that's a great place if you go to a school that is integrated and has a decent, diverse population. That's a great place to interact with people. And I so, hope for the day that you and everyone else can return to those in-person, so-called normal, end quote, normal ways of interacting with people. But we're at a great disadvantage now. And one of the things that I've been talking about is like how hard it is to do new political organizing at this time when everything is virtual. Because if people already know each other and they're working together, then Zoom can work to a degree and after a fashion. But for people who have never met each other and have no knowledge of each other, Zoom is Zoom and other things like Zoom, very, very flat. It's a flat way of interacting. And like conferences, we should be having multiple conferences in the best of all possible worlds now around what we experienced this summer. the incredible outpouring of action in response to the multiple murders, starting with George Floyd's murder. And as I said, multiple conferences would be happening, national, local, statewide, regional, etc. And it's the person that you're standing next to in the registration line who you had the conversation with. That's what makes a conference worth it. And then you kind of, you get to talking. Oh, are you going to such and such a workshop? Oh, I'm really excited to hear this person or the other person speak. And that's what makes conferences just remarkable. It's like what's planned and then what's not planned. The same is true then of like going to a political meeting. And as I said, nowadays, we just don't have those same kinds of options. But do not give up. Please don't give up. And do what you can. Ask if you're in contact with other people who you do know, ask them what they're doing around this very issue. I'm challenging you, and have not just you individually, Henry, but I'm challenging people in the webinar to desegregate your lives, and then we're talking about the roadblocks to doing that because of the historical period we're living through. So just don't give up, and know that that world and those opportunities will be ready for you when the time evolves to when being out in public and being with other people is safer. And that's a great question. I appreciate it.
All right, and next up we have Aaron. Aaron, if you could unmute your mic and activate your camera.
Hello?
We see you.
Okay. So first of all, thank you for doing this. I'm in Washington State, and what we're dealing with here is well, among a lot of other things, we have a regulatory agency which is overseeing a cannabis industry that's multi-billion-dollar industry, and it's created a market that is almost completely excluding African Americans from ownership in the licenses. And I just wanted to see if you had any advice as far as dealing with a situation like that in a state like Washington, which is supposedly considered a progressive state, but is producing this inequitable system.
Right. Thank you so much, Aaron. I really appreciate it. And the example and the question that you're raising shows how institutional white supremacy just gets replicated and replicated. I've heard that about states where cannabis and a cannabis business or industry is indeed flourishing and growing up, and how people of color are really excluded, structurally excluded, and maybe even intentionally excluded from it. The first thing I would ask is who are your representatives in office? Is this a discussion you're having with them? Because I would imagine some of this falls in the realm of legal restrictions and legal standards for who can get involved and how. So I would get in touch with local elected officials or whatever level of elected officials, local or state, that are controlling the situation and making decisions about it as it is. I would also be looking at I assume that maybe small business loans or other kinds of business loans, financing, that might be a part of it as well. And that would take, some pressure. Is it that people can't qualify because they don't have a certain amount of money to put into a business to begin with? I don't know what the barriers are. Is it that banks and conventional financial institutions won't give loans to people who wish to start such a business? Is it because people who may have some kind of record with the legal system can't be a part of it because their past history prevents them from doing so? I don't know what the barriers are. but I suggested getting in contact with your elected representatives. I also would suggest that you try to form a group, a grassroots organization whose focus is just what you described, trying to desegregate and to have that cannabis industry become more inclusive. The pressure, you individually talking to an elected official isn't going to have the same impact as there being a group with a great name. It's always good to have a great name for these groups, but that, a grassroots organization that is serious and conscientious about changing that. And then maybe also, maybe there's some people who are already in the industry who are white might actually be susceptible to and open to hearing about this issue of being excluded and ostracized from participation. There might actually be some people who are already in, if they are connected with, who would say, I never thought of it that way. I don't think that's right. Let's see if we can work together to try to make this not be the case. So those are just off the top of my head suggestions. And the suggestions that I made will work for quite a few other situations that are not about cannabis.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for coming here from afar.
Barbara, did you still want to take, there's one more hand up. I know you have another interview later, so.
No,
sure. Yeah,
hey,
all right.
Why not?
Here we go. Here we go. Next up is Alexandra. Alexandra, if you could activate your mic and camera, please. If you put your mouse over your Zoom window, it should show you a mic and a camera picture where you can click to do that. Well, there may be some technical difficulties there.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
Oh, we got the camera going.
Okay.
All right.
Sorry about that. I somehow minimized Zoom while I was trying to respond. So my name's Lexa. I grew up in Albany, read you in college, then had you as my city council person. One other thing I wanted to thank you for doing this, because to speak to Henry's question about connecting, like I now run a food co-op in New London, Connecticut. I come back and forth on weekends to Chatham where I have a house. And I think that at this time, like doing things on social media with people you absolutely don't know is very challenging, but having people, especially a conversation with a cluster of people who know each other, then inviting other people into it, I think can be really powerful. So like I knew Dorothy Tristman since I was like 10, and seeing her introducing you is like, it reminds me that there's a constellation of people that are operating in spaces that I'm not in anymore. And that I think that I think that one of the things that we need right now, or at least I need right now, is reassurance that there is more happening than, like this is a moment that we should seize. And that I guess if I have a question for you is like, what new dimensions do you see in this moment that, like, do you see parallels to what was happening in the 60s in terms of the energy and the political consciousness evolving? Or do you feel like this is just more, like how significant is this time for you?
Well, this time is totally significant for me, as witnessed by the fact that I felt motivated to do nothing but write all summer long. And I haven't done that for quite some time. It was what was happening that motivated me to write that first article, and then as an outgrowth of the first, then I got to write the second. So personally, that shows an impact on me of the current events. My heart remains and stays broken. You know, I've had a broken heart since I was a kid, for personal reasons and for political reasons as well. So it's not like my heart is not like just twisted into knots by witnessing the incredible sadistic cruelty toward people like me, because that's what it's about. You know, it's not the miscellaneous person over there in Kenosha, Wisconsin, or in Atlanta, Georgia, or in Minneapolis, Minnesota, or in Rochester, New York. It's not about miscellaneous people for us in cases of violence for us as Black people. It's about us. We know that can happen to us. We know it can happen to people like us and to people who we care about. So it's a lot to deal with, and I began with anger today, conveying anger from other people's voices, talking about the rebellions, as Gary Young did, and then Ellie Misdall's really incredible piece. So it has definitely had an impact. In many ways, this is far different from anything that happened in the 1960s, because it's a 50-state plus the colonies / territories response plus the globe. The entire globe has responded to US white supremacy, the entire globe. You know, you're in a different paradigm when people in Paris and, you know, probably Rome and London and probably in Czechoslovakia, you know, and Prague, you know, in Australia, New Zealand. I mean, I don't know all the places where this happened, where people were out saying Black Lives Matter. And then in the towns and villages of upstate New York and in places like that all over the country, where you don't necessarily even have a significant population of people of color. And so it's really different. I think one of the things that I would say about the 60s that gave it a lot of potential that may not be in existence now, although I don't want to be too much of a chauvinist about my youth and my growing up years, there was a really deep political edge in the 60s. And by that, I mean, there were people who were putting out stuff and ideas. I'm thinking about Malcolm X in particular. I'm thinking about SNCC as an organization. I'm thinking about Kwame Ture, Angela Davis, Kathleen Cleaver, Assata Shakur. I mean, there were people who were putting out some really serious stuff. And the US power structure, ruling class, they decided we have got to get this thing under control right now. And Nixon was the perfect guy for that, racist and anti-Semitic and et cetera as he was. He's probably sexist too, with his daughters. You know, he only had daughters, but two daughters. But the thing is that, you know, he was a piece of work, not to say something else that I can't say on camera. But they suppressed that. I was watching MSNBC this morning, and they were talking about the possibilities for this election. And is it going to go the way that it went in '68 with Nixon and '80 with Reagan? I think they cited Bush, you know, in 2000. Which direction is the nation going to go in? And we have the most archetypal, evil, despicable, ignorant, vicious, racist, and creature and individual in that office that we have ever seen. They were also playing a speech of his, I guess, from just yesterday, and he was talking about how he was going to become more vicious. And he was saying it with such relish. He said, I'll become even more vicious. And I don't know what it was in action or relation to, but just imagine we're in a situation where the president of the United States is talking about how much more vicious he is going to become. So it's not all about the elections by any means, but we are in a very, very, very intense period of global pandemic in the United States, a botched response to the pandemic. So our numbers of cases and our numbers of death outpace any Western nation in the world because of that creature who I just referred to, who apparently, as of this, well, last week, we found out Bob Woodward, thank God for him, he found out that he knew all along how serious it was, and he didn't give a flying. He did not care. So that's happening, like 1 minute away, 2 minutes away from fascism is happening. Global pandemic is happening, and racial warfare, race war, is occurring on a scale, and also response to that by people who are fed up and do not wish to live in a white supremacist nation anymore. So I can't really give you answers. All I can say is that we actually are the people who get to formulate the answers by our actions and by our decisions.
Right, we're the people we're waiting for.
Yeah, exactly. We're the people we've been waiting for. And fighting white supremacy helps to answer the questions that you raise, however you can fight it. And so nice to see you. I'd love to know what street you lived on in my ward, but say, no, you don't live there anymore, so you can actually say it.
Yeah, I didn't actually live in your ward. I lived on Lancaster Street, but I grew up in Albany, and yeah.
So I did not directly represent you then.
No, you did not. You were not my constituent. I was not your direct constituent. No.
Right, indeed. Well, I served a lot of people.
You represented our interests as a city, so
yeah,
I thank you.
I served a lot of people from a lot of wards used to call me.
I bet.
And on that note, I just want to say thank you. I think we're concluding, and I hope that people will go into Zoom rooms. And if you don't do that today because this has gone over long, maybe you'll get into Zoom rooms in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much, Barbara. Thank you for sharing your time, your words, your resources. I am going to take the next moment that I can to start digging into all of the resources that you've shared with us over this and the last 2 talks that you've given us. So just to reiterate that there is a link to the Barbara Smith Caring Circle in the chat, and any donations that you can give are going to be just ensuring that we are able to continue having these resources in the coming months and years. And we also are going to have this and the other 2 videos up on YouTube. So you can share them broadly with your circles so that we can make sure that as many people as possible are able to hear and grow from these discussions. And now, if you would like to join us, Chris is going to be posting the link to another Zoom meeting, a little like cocktail hour, if you will, so that we can have the opportunity to see each other's faces and to talk to one another and really dive into some of the little gems that we've been given during this conversation.
So Sienna, where's my cocktail? And people who know me know that I don't drink, so that was a joke. Where's my chocolate milkshake? That's all.
Oh,
that's what I.
Yeah. Chocolate. Yeah. So there is going to be a little bit of a limbo because they're both being hosted by Chris's Zoom room. So if you click, it should be a live link in the chat, which you can click, and then it'll put you in a waiting room. And then as soon as this meeting has concluded officially, then it will open up the following meeting so that we can get into the further conversation. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much to XR Capital Region for doing this.
Yeah.
Thank you, Barbara. It's been amazing.
Thank you.
I'm just going to leave this room open for another 30 seconds to a minute, just in case people have to kind of cut and paste the Zoom room address.
Mm-hmm. Can you post it one more time, Chris? Thank you.
How's that look?
It's there. Yeah.
Cool.
Great. Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome.
Okay, I'm gonna hop off and join the waiting room for the next meeting.
All right, I'll see you over there.
Sounds good.